It's a moment every parent dreams of. The day their child is born. The joy, the excitement, and the overwhelming sense of love that fills the room when a baby enters the world. But for one family, the day their baby girl was born took a turn no one could have predicted. What should have been one of the happiest days of their lives quickly spiraled into something more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. It all started when the proud new dad, exhausted but overjoyed, picked up the morning newspaper after his wife had just given birth. The last thing he expected was to see something that would shake him to his core. The headline on the front page wasn't just an ordinary news story. It was something that sent a chill down his spine, something that he couldn't ignore. No matter how hard he tried to convince himself it was a mistake, what was in that newspaper? What was it that made this father, who had just welcomed his precious baby girl into the world, dial 911 in sheer panic? In that moment, he couldn't stop his heart from racing, his thoughts from spiraling. Something didn't add up, and he knew he had to act fast. But what could he do when the truth was so far out of his reach? The story he was about to uncover would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew. As a parent, you never expect the unimaginable to happen. But sometimes, life throws you a curveball, and you have to trust your instincts, no matter how strange they seem. This is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, wondering what the real truth is, and how far you'd go to protect the ones you love. As the father hurriedly made that call, he could hardly form the words. His mind raced in disbelief. He had no idea how this could be happening, how his world had just been turned upside down in the blink of an eye. Was it a simple misunderstanding, or was something far darker at play? In the coming moments, this family would be forced to confront a reality they were unprepared for. And just when they thought they could breathe a sigh of relief, they were pulled back into a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and urgency. What happens next? You won't believe the twists and turns this story is about to take. Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning. The phone rang sharply in the quiet of the hospital room. Sarah, the new mother, was exhausted but elated, lying back in her hospital bed with her baby girl cradled peacefully in her arms. She had been through hours of labor, and now, finally, she could relax and focus on what mattered most, her daughter. As the father, James, stood by the window, trying to calm his nerves and process the overwhelming emotions flooding his mind, he couldn't shake the unease he felt after glancing at the newspaper. He had set it down, hoping it was all a misunderstanding, but it lingered in his thoughts. He had read that headline over and over, but his mind struggled to make sense of it. Local missing girl found in nearby town. The headline boldly proclaimed. His eyes darted to the accompanying photo of a young child, a girl with dark hair and wide eyes, standing in front of a brightly colored house. The moment his gaze locked with that image, his heart dropped into his stomach. The resemblance was uncanny. He couldn't ignore it. It was the same girl, the one he was holding in his arms. His pulse quickened as panic set in. His mind raced. How could this be? This couldn't be true, could it? His thoughts spun, trying to piece together what he had just read. But the details in the article only fueled his confusion. The missing girl had been reported months ago, a tragic case that had haunted the community, but the police had been unable to locate her. James had followed the news closely in the past, as anyone would, but never in his wildest dreams did he think he'd be the one at the center of a situation like this. Could the baby he had just welcomed into the world really be someone else's? His hand trembled as he dialed 911. He had no idea what he was about to say or what was going to happen next. All he knew was that he had to do something. His instinct told him to act, to protect his family. But what was he even protecting them from? The uncertainty was suffocating. He didn't know if it was a case of mistaken identity or something far more sinister. He didn't know what to believe anymore. The operator's voice on the other end of the line was calm, but James could hear the urgency in his own voice. He explained as best as he could, trying to make sense of the mess of emotions, facts, and the chilling newspaper article that had set everything into motion. He described the photo, his daughter, and the nagging feeling in his gut that something was wrong. The operator listened carefully, asking him to remain calm and wait for the authorities to arrive. Meanwhile, Sarah had no idea what was going on. She was too focused on her newborn daughter to notice the mounting tension in the room. The doctor had just left after checking on both of them, and the room was filled with a quiet peace, the kind that comes after the storm of childbirth. But James wasn't there to share in that moment. He was pacing back and forth, his mind trapped in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The father's protective instincts were kicking in, but they were clouded by doubt and a growing sense of dread. James knew the police would be arriving soon, but what could they do? He was terrified of what they might find, or worse, what they might not find at all. He had to understand, had to make sense of this before anything else happened. But every attempt to brush off the fears only seemed to intensify them. As he stood by the window, trying to calm his racing heart, he thought back to the months before. He had been so excited when he and Sarah first found out they were expecting. Their lives had been filled with joy and planning. They decorated the nursery, bought tiny clothes, and imagined the life they would share as a family of 3. Their baby girl had been perfect from the moment she was born. But now, the world they had built together was crumbling under the weight of a single, haunting question. Was this truly their child? When the police arrived, they were met with a scene of confusion and chaos. James tried to explain the situation as clearly as he could, but the more he spoke, the more the officers looked at him with suspicion. Was he really questioning the legitimacy of his own child? Or was something darker at play? The tension in the room grew thicker with every word, every uncertain glance. James could feel the weight of the officers' stares as they looked over his newborn daughter. Every moment that passed felt like an eternity, and his anxiety only deepened. Sarah, who had been unaware of the escalating situation, finally looked up from her daughter, sensing the strange atmosphere in the room. She was confused and startled by the presence of strangers, the police officers, standing silently at the foot of her bed. She turned to James, her eyes filled with questions. "James, what's going on? Why are they here?" Her voice broke through the tension, but it only added to the uncertainty that hung in the air. James had no answers for her. He wished he could assure her that everything was fine, but the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know if their daughter was truly their own, or if they were caught in the middle of something far beyond their control. As the investigation began, more and more questions emerged. How could this missing child have ended up in their care? Was there a mix-up at the hospital? Was there a conspiracy at play? The possibilities seemed endless, and with every twist, the family found themselves trapped in a web of fear and suspicion. Every day that passed without answers only made the uncertainty more unbearable. But nothing could prepare them for what came next. Just when James thought they were beginning to unravel the mystery, a new revelation would turn everything on its head. The truth was closer than they thought, but the consequences of discovering it would change everything they believed to be true. As the investigation into the missing girl deepened, the tension between James and Sarah grew. Trust began to erode, and doubts crept into their relationship. Could their love survive this nightmare? Could they ever look at their daughter the same way again? And if they were wrong, If this really was their baby girl, how could they ever prove it? The answers, it seemed, were just out of reach, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally come crashing down. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The investigation into the missing girl had reached a boiling point. The more they learned, the more questions arose, and the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. Days turned into weeks, and James and Sarah found themselves living in a constant state of tension, uncertainty, and fear. The police had dug into every angle, interviewed everyone they could think of, and even conducted DNA tests on their baby girl. But the answers they were desperately seeking never seemed to come. Each passing day only added weight to the fear that hung over them. Then, just when it felt like they were running out of options, a breakthrough came. The police were able to track down the woman who had been caring for the missing girl before her disappearance. A tip from an anonymous source led them to a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. There, they uncovered a shocking truth, one that no one could have anticipated. The woman had been running a black market baby adoption ring, secretly switching babies and selling them to unsuspecting families. The missing girl, the one James had seen in the newspaper, wasn't the only child who had been stolen from her rightful parents. As the truth came to light, everything began to fall into place. The photograph in the newspaper, the resemblance to their daughter, the nagging feeling James couldn't shake. It was all connected, but it wasn't the conclusion anyone had hoped for. James and Sarah's worst fears had been realized. Their baby girl, the one they had loved from the moment she was born, was not their biological child. She had been taken from her real parents and placed with them under false pretenses. The revelation hit James hard. The emotional turmoil he had experienced was overwhelming. He couldn't understand how something like this could happen, how their world had been turned upside down so quickly. But as the facts became undeniable, he couldn't deny what had to be done. It wasn't just about their family anymore. It was about the girl who had been stolen from her real parents, about the truth that had been buried for so long. The decision to contact the biological parents wasn't easy, but James knew it was the right thing to do. They needed to give this little girl back to her real family. When the parents were found, they were beyond grateful, but also heartbroken by the time they had lost with their daughter. It was a complicated moment, filled with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and gratitude. For James and Sarah, it was a bittersweet ending. They had grown to love the girl as their own, and the thought of letting her go was heartbreaking. But they knew that in doing so, they were doing what was best for her. In the end, the love they had for this child was selfless. They didn't want her to be lost in a world of secrets and lies. The journey had changed them. It had tested their strength as individuals, as a couple, and as parents. They had learned that sometimes life throws you into situations you never saw coming, and you have to make decisions that go beyond your own desires and fears. But most importantly, they had learned the true meaning of family. It wasn't just about biology. It was about the love you give and receive, the sacrifices you make, and the bonds that can never be broken. In the days that followed, James and Sarah found peace in knowing they had done the right thing. They had been part of something bigger than themselves, and in a world that often seemed full of confusion and chaos, they had found clarity. Their hearts ached for the family they had to part with, but they also knew they had given the missing girl the chance to grow up in the family she truly belonged to. As they looked back on it all, they realized that their lives would never be the same. The experience had shaped them in ways they hadn't expected, but they had emerged stronger, more connected, and more aware of the fragile nature of life. They had learned that sometimes, even the most heart-wrenching decisions are the ones that lead to the greatest healing. In the end, it wasn't about finding answers. It was about the journey, the choices they made, and the love that guided them through the darkest moments. And though the story had come to a close, the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever, reminding them that sometimes the truth is stranger and more complicated than we could ever imagine. Manny.